Amen. You guys can have a seat. All right, I'm fired up to be at Revision this morning. How about you? All right. All right. That was a mediocre amount of fire, but we'll get there. So my junior year of high school was at a track meet, and it was towards the end of the season on one of those days that should have been warm, but it was unseasonably cold in the spring. And I know you're probably having a hard time picturing what that might be like. Cold in the spring, right? But because it was cold and I was cold and I didn't feel like it, I decided not to stretch and not to warm up before one of my races. I just wanted to stay bundled up. And you're going to be shocked to hear this, but it did not work out well for me. At the end of a 200-meter race, I pulled a muscle in my quad, like right at the end. And it hurt really, really badly. And I felt like I could barely walk, but I didn't want to tell my coach for a couple reasons. Number one, in a little bit, the 4x1 was coming up, and we were trying to post a qualifying time, and I wanted to run. And number two, and this is probably the bigger reason, if I told him that I pulled a muscle while running, he was going to ask me about my warm-up, and after I told him I didn't, he was going to yell at me for being an idiot, and that just didn't sound like a lot of fun. And so I decided to fix it myself, and I limped over to the trainer's bag, and inside there's like a bunch of magical tapes and sprays and wraps, and I was looking for one thing in particular, Kramer-Jezik Atomic Balm, okay? This stuff is like icy hot on steroids, and Atomic Balm is not just a clever nickname, it is a description of the feeling you get when you rub this ointment on your body. And so 20 minutes before the 4x1, I said I better warm up this time, and it hurt so bad that I didn't think just a little bit would do, and so I got a huge glop of Kramer-Jezik Atomic Balm, and I just rubbed it all over my leg. And it's difficult to fully describe the feeling that I felt right afterwards, but fire is a good start. It just felt like someone had doused my leg in gasoline and then lit a match, and it was burning. But the burning got me through the 4x1, and then I went as quickly as I could and grabbed a bag of ice and then put the ice on top of my leg and pulled up my shorts and left the bottom of my leg against the cold bleachers and just laid there in an intense amount of pain for a really, really long time. And as I was laying there, I thought to myself, I kind of wish I hadn't done that. Like, I'm not sure I needed that much Atomic Balm to make it through, and I'm not sure this was the best decision, and to this day, I can still remember that feeling, like that burning sensation in my leg because it hurt so bad. But the truth is, I never would have made it 100 meters. I never would have been able to run that race if I hadn't used the balm, because this is true in life and in the world and at track meets. When the problem is severe, the cure has to be powerful. It's the only way. I think there's this dilemma in human history where a lot of us would like to eliminate the church as a necessary vehicle in the world. There's this sense from people both inside and outside the church that the church has hurt us and embarrassed us so much that it would be great if the church just didn't exist anymore, if we didn't need it anymore, if the church didn't have to be a part of society anymore. We've got people who are Christians and non-Christians who imagine what it might be like if we could just get rid of this church because it's been embarrassing and it's caused so much hurt and pain over the years. And it's weird to say that in a church, right? To say that the church has been embarrassing, but it has. It's weird to say in a church that the church has hurt people, but it has, and I think we need to acknowledge that. Like when there are abuse scandals, when there are pastors who have affairs or who embezzle money, when there are protesters holding up signs that say, God hates, fill in the blank, it's the church that bears the stains more than it is the individuals. And when people are serving as deacons in their local church and wizards in their local KKK chapter at the same time, it's the church that people think of. It's the church that people associate with the hatred and the pain and the failure. It's the church that bears the stains. And the church throughout history has often given Jesus a really bad name and a really bad reputation. I think sometimes there's something inside of us and inside of the people in our world that just wishes we could do without it. Hold that thought. When I first got to high school, like my first couple weeks there, I realized that I was not the first Howard to ever walk into Davenport Central. The name Howard already had a reputation, and it was not a good one. Apparently, not only at Central High School, but in the entire town of Davenport and in the entire Quad Cities, there's this massive family of Howards. And the Howards are drug dealers and criminals, many of whom had been kicked out of my high school before. And so as I sat there as a little, how old are you as a freshman? 14-year-old freshman kid, and people called off my name on the roster, I literally saw teachers taken aback and chuckle when they saw me raising their hands. Because they're like, Michael Howard? And they'd look up and be like, oh. And I had people during the first couple weeks of high school come up to me, both teachers and students and staff members, and be like, oh, so you're a Howard, huh? And just laugh. And my first blush response as a kid, as a ninth grader, as a freshman, was to feel embarrassed by that. Feel a little bit embarrassed of my name, because my name meant something in that place that I just did not want to be associated with. And a couple weeks in, I decided, wait a minute. That's not me. I can either let my name define me, or I can define my name. In our world and in our culture, the word church has a negative reputation. It's taken on a negative connotation in many ways. For many people, it evokes a bad texture and a bad taste, but that's our name. It's our name, and we can either pretend that it isn't our name. We can try really hard to live in a space in this world where we're not the church and we're not called the church, so that we can hopefully avoid the baggage of at least 1,500 years of really poor decision making by a lot of people, ourselves included. Or we can embrace that name and we can define that name. We can redefine that name for a culture and a world that doesn't understand what the church was created to be, and that needs the church to function the way it was created to be, because that's how Jesus designed it, and that's what Jesus created us for. And this morning I want to cast a vision of that. I want to stir you guys up this morning, because I'm convinced that the church is the powerful cure God's given the world for the severe brokenness that it's facing. We're in the second week of this series called Catalyst. And last week, I talked about how God has us here for a reason. Whether you're a native in Des Moines, you were born here or back here, or you're here by choice, or whether you're a captive and somehow you got dragged here by a spouse or by a job or by God tugging at your heart. Whether you got here on purpose or not on purpose, whether you want to be here or not here, we're here. And because we're here now, God wants to use us in this space to be catalytic, to be people who bring change to a city that is desperately in need of change. And this morning I want to dig a little bit deeper into how we do that, into what it looks like to be a catalytic force in the city of Des Moines, into how we live that out as the church, how we can live into this name that we have, how we can redefine this name for this culture in ways that bring hope to the hopeless people that are all around us. Because I believe, I'm convinced that in the places and in the spaces, in the moments and the times where the church has been embarrassing or frustrating or angering or boring or useless, those are the times when the church has failed to be the catalyst that Jesus dreamed it could be and intended it would be. So we're going to dig into Matthew chapter 16 this morning. If you have your Bibles or your phones, you can open them up to Matthew 16. And there are these two stories back to back in verses 13 through 28. And we're going to look at one story this morning and the other story next week, and they seem like two totally different stories. But Matthew stacks them back to back here, and what's really interesting is that in Luke's narrative of Jesus' life, he stacks these same two stories back to back, and so does Mark. And if you've read the Gospels, you know that doesn't always happen. In fact, it rarely happens that they tell stories in the same order, and that's not evidence that they're inaccurate. It's just that in the first century, when people wrote nonfiction, they wrote it thematically rather than chronologically. That just doesn't make any sense to us because we like to write stories chronologically, but that's not how they did it. But the fact that all three of these gospel writers put these two stories, the one we're going to look at this morning and next week, back to back, shows us that they're saying these two things belong together. They may seem like two totally separate incidents, but this matters. And I love these stories because this is the place in Jesus' life and in his ministry where for the first time he really explicitly and really intentionally connects his mission and his vision. His mission while he's on the planet and his vision for after he leaves. See, Jesus' mission was to die for our reconciliation, and his vision was to launch a church that would tell the world. So if you have your Bibles or phones, we're going to start in verse 13 this morning. If you don't, you can grab them from the Next Steps table and keep it. We'd love to give you a Bible. And if you don't want to do that right now, don't worry, the words will be on the screen. But this is what Matthew says starting in verse 13. He says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." There's a lot going on in this story, in these 6 verses. But what I want to do is take a look at these 3 highlights, these 3 things this passage has to tell us about who Jesus is that we got to understand if we're going to be the church that Jesus wants us to be. If we as a local body called Revision are going to live out the catalytic vision that Jesus has for us right here, right now in Des Moines. And the first thing we got to understand is this: who Jesus is matters. Who Jesus is matters. Like, here's this passage where Jesus, for the first time, introduces his followers, his disciples, to this idea that he's going to build this thing called the church in the world. For the first time, he starts to cast this vision for what's going to happen after he's gone. And he starts to paint this picture of what the church is going to look like. And before he even gets into that, he asks them who I am. Or who do people say that I am? You wonder why? Like, why, if Jesus is going to talk about the church, does he start by asking the question, who am I? And he does it because he wants them to understand what he understands, that who he is, who Jesus is the absolute foundation of the entire thing. And if Jesus is anybody other than who Jesus is, then the church is useless in the world. Like, if Jesus isn't the God of the universe who came for us, who gave his life on a cross so that we could be forgiven and set free and reconciled, if he's anything other or anything less than that, then the church doesn't matter. So he asks them, who do people say that I am? And they start rattling stuff off. They're like, well, some say you're John the Baptist, or some people say you're Elijah, or some people say you're Jeremiah. And we tend to look back at that because we know who Jesus is, and we think that that's like insulting. Like, Jesus is God, and they're comparing him to Elijah. But we got to understand this, for the people in that day, that was like the highest compliment they could pay. Okay, here's all these people, this nation of Israel, and they're looking at this guy, and they're like, something is going on. This human being is different than everybody else. Something crazy is going on with him. Like, let's try and wrap our minds around who he is. Maybe he's Elijah. Come back. Like, this is the highest compliment they could pay. Jeremiah, that might have been a compliment. It's like depressed Jesus. You ever read Jeremiah? He's like a depressing, I don't know. But like, he's Elijah, he's Jeremiah, and they're trying to pay these compliments. And there are a lot of people who look at him and say like, wow, something's going on, something different's here. And they're saying a lot of things about him, but they're not saying the one thing that matters. And that thing is that he's God. You know what? Like 2,000 years later, that's pretty much still the way our world talks about Jesus. All around the world, people love Jesus. People really like him. You'd be hard-pressed to go to any corner on this globe and find very many people who detest Jesus, who are like, Jesus, God was a jerk, right? Everybody, everywhere, has this connection to this Christ, this one life that changed the world. And some people don't like him, but like all around the world, people like Jesus. They don't always like the church, but they like Jesus. For Buddhists, he's a path. For Muslims, he's a prophet. For Hindus, he's just another god among the pantheon. And for atheists, he's this great philosopher, but he's really none of those things. And understanding who he really is matters. That he's the God who came to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. Because all those other things, if he's Elijah, if he's Jeremiah, if he's John the Baptist, if he's a Buddha, if he's a path, if he's another God among many, all those other confessions about who Jesus is, no matter how nice they are, no matter how well-meaning they are, what they are is painting Jesus as a person who points us towards the effort we need to make on our own to be saved, toward the striving that has to happen in our own lives to earn our salvation. And who Jesus really is the God who said, I did it for you because you couldn't do it on your own, and I want to invite you into my family. That's who Jesus is. And it matters that people have an encounter with that Jesus, that they understand he's not just some dead guy that we believe existed. I think we've come to this harmful place as Christians in the Western world where we think that like just believing Jesus existed is what matters most. Like if we can just believe that Jesus really was real or believe that Jesus really did some of the stuff that the Bible says that he did, that's what matters. And we've gotten to that point because of this like post-enlightenment baloney. There's a philosopher named Rene Descartes, right? And he came along and he wrote, I think, therefore I am. And ever since Descartes wrote this idea down, I think, therefore I am, the Western world has been absolutely captivated by the idea that the entirety of our identity, the entirety of our existence on this planet is made up of our thoughts, the way that we think and the way that we feel. And so when it comes to belief and when it comes to faith, we've reduced Jesus, this living God who wants a relationship with us, we've reduced him to an idea in our head. Like he's some historical figure we believe existed, the way that we believe Abe Lincoln existed, but Abe is dead and Jesus is not. It matters who Jesus is because it matters that people have an encounter with a God who created them for relationship with himself. An encounter like Peter had. This is what happened to Peter, right? Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter blurts it out. "You're the Messiah, you're the Christ, you're the one who's been promised from Adam and Eve all throughout history, all throughout generations. You're God." You guys know, like, the story of Peter. Those who've read the Gospels, Peter got it wrong all the time. And so I don't know that this happened, but I'm guessing, like, when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter's like, you're the Messiah, you're God. All the other disciples start rolling their eyes and looking at each other like, "Oh, you guys, Peter's blowing it again." Oh. And then Jesus is like, "You're right." And they're like, number one, Jesus is God. Number two, Peter was right. And then Jesus says, "But you cheated." And they feel a lot better about that because Peter couldn't have been right if he didn't cheat. But like Peter has this encounter with God, and his encounter with God showed him who the real Jesus was, and it changed everything. And thousands of years after Peter had that encounter, that is exactly what people still need, because an encounter with the living God who came and died for them is the only thing that can change people and bring lasting hope. Like, who Jesus is matters. And the church exists to create a space where people can encounter him and they can see that. And that's why Jesus built the church. The second thing we got to understand if we're going to live out the catalytic future that God has for Revision is this: what Jesus was building matters. What he was building matters. See, after Peter confesses that he's God, Jesus looks at him and he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my ecclesia." That's Greeklish for you, okay? Roughly translated, what Jesus is saying is, you are rock man, and on this rock I will build my church. And for a way, way too long time, the church has spent way, way too much energy worrying about what the word rock means in that sentence. Like, what's the rock? What's the rock on which the church is built? And for Catholics, the rock is Peter, because that makes sense, because he's called him rock man. So then Peter was the first pope, so we got to follow the popes. That's not what Jesus was talking about at all. It was just clever wordplay, because Jesus was funny. He's funnier than we give him credit for, okay? He's saying, like, this rock, this confession that I am God come for you. Or even this encounter that Peter had, this idea that the God of the universe wants to crash into your life and have a part of your story, that he wants to step into your history. That's the rock. But the rock doesn't matter, okay? Rock is not the operative word in that sentence. Rock is not Jesus' point. Church is the operative word in that sentence. We get so caught up on what was the rock, and Jesus is saying, I'm building a church. That's what we should get out of this passage, that Jesus came to build a church. But what he's building, like what the church is, it matters. And what the church isn't matters, because we hear church, and people in our world hear church, and there are a lot of images that flash in our minds. There are a lot of ideas that we have of what a church is and what a church can be and what a church should be. And for a lot of us, the picture that we have in our heads as soon as we hear the word church is a building. It's some ornate place that we go to, some place, some space that's holier than all the other places, and maybe full of people that are holier than thou and judgmental. And there's all these ideas that we have about what a church is. But the word church that Jesus uses here is this Greek word ekklesia. Everybody say ekklesia with me. Ekklesia. Well, ekklesia means congregation. It doesn't mean building, it means people. It means a gathering. Literally, ekklesia means called out. It means a community of called out ones. See, the ekklesia that Jesus is building is these people that Jesus called out of darkness into light, out of death and into life. And this community, this ekklesia of Jesus is unique in the world. It's unique in the world. It's the only vehicle that carries the confession about who Jesus is made inside that revelation that God gave to Peter. It's the only undefeatable force the world has ever known. It's the only real, lasting, hope-filled change organism that exists on this planet, and it's a place for everybody. It's a place for every human on this planet who Jesus came to call out of darkness into light, out of death and into life. And it has to be a place where everybody belongs. It has to be a place of community because that's the name. That's the name that Jesus gave it. And so that's what it has to be. And it's powerful when it's that. It's powerful when it's not a place that we go to or a thing that we do or some club that we're a part of that makes us better, but it's this community of people who are doing life together. So then the world can look and maybe they can believe that one of us is a really great person, but they look at us and say, wow, something is different there. Something's happening in that community and the love is real. And if God can do that for all of them, maybe he can do that for me. Like the church, I'm convinced, like some of the deepest scars and wounds that people have, some of the places in the world that are most broken are the fault of a church that hasn't been the catalytic force for love and community that Jesus designed it to be, that Jesus named it to be. And being a community where we welcome people in and love them doesn't mean we got to be a community where everybody's told they're perfect and they can do whatever they want. That's not love. It's cruel indifference. But it means we can never become a community that's all about us, this navel-gazing thing where we're focused on who we are, where we're more focused on who we're trying to keep than who we're trying to reach, where we're focused on gaining our own comfort, where we're focused on drawing the lines in the sand between who's in and who's out and who can be in and what they have to look like, think like, be like, act like, dress like if they're going to be a part of us. Because when we do that, in part we deny the fact that at one point we were all wanderers of some variety. And the church of Jesus Christ, because it is the church, welcomed us in with open arms. And in part, when we do that, we forget what it means to be the ecclesia. We forget the name that Jesus gave us. But this community that shows Jesus to the world, that welcomes people in, and that brings love to people who are desperate for it, that's what Jesus was building when he said, I am building my church, my ecclesia. And that's what he's still building today, right here. A space, a group of people changed completely because they encountered the living God. A community where no matter what else is going on in someone else's life, and no matter how the world has treated them, they know that they can find a home. I was convinced we weren't built to fight the great battles of this life alone. We were never meant to. We were wired to face them together. So one of the core values at Revision, one of the things that shapes everything we think and everything we say and everything we do is this idea that God loves us and loved people do life together. Loved people do life together. People ask me pretty regularly in this season, like, how's your church going? And it's kind of a weird question. Like, it's a really nice question. I think sometimes people ask questions and then, like, pastors and theologians jump on and like, that's not the right question to ask. And so I don't want to do that. When people ask, I would say, great, because Revision is great, and I love it so much. But when people ask that in my heart and say, how's your church going? It's this weird question for me because I feel like I don't own a church owns me. It doesn't belong to me, I belong to it. I don't have a church has me, and there's this thing that God has given me a lot of responsibility for, and I carry it with me every second of my life. But it's my home and my community and my tribe. And it belongs to Jesus, and I'm convinced that its purpose is to be Jesus and bring Jesus to the world around us. And I'm convinced, too, that it's not an accident that Revision's in Des Moines right here, right now. Okay? It's not incidental that Revision is in Des Moines. It's critical because people in Des Moines need a place to belong. They need a place to belong. What Jesus was building matters, and that's what Jesus was building when he said, I'm going to build my church. And the third thing that matters for us, if we're going to be the catalyst that Jesus designed us to be, is this: how Jesus' ecclesia, how Jesus' church functions matters. I think this passage is so awesome because it provides us with a ridiculously cool vision of how we are supposed to live and move and breathe in the world as a community that loves people and invites them in. And the vision comes from this phrase that Jesus uses right after he tells Peter, like, I'm going to build my church on this rock, and he says, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Okay, just real quick, show of hands. How many of you think that's a weird thing to say? You can raise your hands. That's a weird thing to say. Like, that's one of those things when you're reading, and you're like, what? Oh, Jesus, you're being confusing again. Because a lot of times Jesus said weird stuff, like, the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. What does that even mean? Okay, and if we're going to understand what Jesus meant when he said, hey, I'm going to build this thing and the gates of Hades won't prevail against it, we got to understand two things. And the first is the historical context. Like if we rewind to verse 13, it says that Jesus and his disciples were in this place called Caesarea Philippi. And Caesarea Philippi was one of the most decadent, pagan, wicked places in the entire ancient world. In fact, it was so messed up that Pharisees and devout Jews refused to travel anywhere near the region. And at the center of all the pagan excess of Caesarea Philippi was this temple at the base of this rock called Mount Hermon. And this temple was built around this opening in the cliff, this cave. And there was a little creek that flowed out of the cave, and the people of Caesarea Philippi believed that this cave at which they built the temple and this creek was literally the passage to the underworld that the gods used to travel between earth and Hades. And so they named this cave the Gates of Hades. And right here at this spot, at the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, some of the most evil, unspeakable, and disturbing practices in human history went down. Like in the spring, when they wanted the gods to come back from Hades, they would take infants and they would throw them into the cave until blood flowed out in the stream as a symbol that the gods had accepted the sacrifice and they would come back out of Hades into the world. And it's here, standing there in Caesarea Philippi, looking at this cave, at this wickedness, at this evil, that Jesus says, I'm going to build this church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And what Jesus is saying is, there is so much horrible, painful wickedness in the world, but it's not okay, and the church is the weapon that I have fashioned to fight against it. And the second thing we got to understand, if we're going to get a picture of what Jesus is talking about, if we're going to let our hearts and our imaginations be captured by the picture Jesus is painting here, the second thing we got to understand is what gates are and what gates aren't. And this one should be self-explanatory, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Gates are formidable, but gates are not an offensive weapon. Okay, because sometimes we read this passage and we're like, oh, the gates of Hades cannot prevail against us. Oh, good, they won't get us. Get us? Gates aren't going anywhere. Gates are gates. They're stationary. Okay? Just let me ask you this serious question. If you happen to be headed to the suit store to buy some new suits with your friends, and four of you are walking along in an alley and things escalate quickly, which one of these pictures is scarier? Okay? We got one with a gun, a club, brass knuckles, and a grenade, okay? Or gun, club, brass knuckles, and a gate, okay? Which one is scary? A grenade is scarier than a gate. You don't attack people with a gate. A gate is a defensive weapon. And this is intuitive, but I'm going to say it anyways again because I want it to be crystal clear. That means that the church of Jesus is designed to storm the gates of hell, to bring the fight to the evil forces that are oppressing the people all around us every day. Jesus is standing there with his disciples, looking at the height of pagan horror and telling them that his church, this thing that he's going to build, is called out and equipped with the power to stand up against the evil, against the brokenness, against the pain, and against the injustice of the world. He's telling them, storm the gates of hell. Don't be afraid of death. I'm about to defeat death from the inside. Storm the gates. Fight against the evil. It's not okay, and I have equipped you to fight it. You can't simply leave the world to its own darkness. You can't simply leave the world to its own hopelessness. My community is called to go out to the most broken places, to go out to the most degenerate of people and give them a hope of a life that's better than the one that they're living, a life that I created them for. I get really frustrated with the way that we talk and think about spiritual warfare in the church today. I think people who get really obsessed with spiritual warfare, people who talk about it a lot, for better or worse, tend to be people who are cut off from the church, people who are cut off from community in some way, who aren't doing life with other people, and a lot of times they get obsessed with it because they're scared. And it seems to me that when we talk about spiritual warfare, a lot of times we talk about it in terms of us being attacked. And we don't like to talk about it much because the Bible tells us we have an enemy that's attacking us, and so we kind of brush it under the rug and we don't talk about it very much, and we're scared because it's scary to be attacked, and it's frightening. There's this moment in The Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, in the book and in the movies, where this massive army of evil orcs and Uruk-hai have come to wipe out all the humans of the nation of Rohan. And these humans are hiding in this fortress in a valley called Helm's Deep, and these huge evil armies are outside. And they're inside, and they can hear the orcs and the Uruk-hai banging on the walls and bashing down the doors, and they're in there frightened. And then at the top of a cliff, the great wizard Gandalf appears. And he brings with him this massive cavalry called the Rohirrim. These warriors from Rohan who'd been expelled when the king was under a spell. And Gandalf and the warriors, at this moment when hope seems lost, charge down the hill into the heart of the enemy to fight against them. And I think sometimes in our lives and in our churches, when we talk and we think about spiritual warfare, we picture ourselves as those timid and pitiable souls inside Helm's Deep. We picture ourselves being attacked by the wicked evil, the gates that are coming to get us. We picture the evil knocking at the door, and we're praying and hoping that God built the doors and the walls just strong enough that it won't get us. And I don't think that's the picture that Jesus has for his church. I don't think that's the vision that Jesus wants us to have when we think about who we are in this world. He wants us to understand we are the Rohirrim. We are the warriors on the hill, following Jesus, charging behind him fearlessly into the battle against evil and brokenness that's all around us. It's about time that we started talking and thinking about spiritual warfare in terms of bringing the fight, not hiding from it. It's time for us to charge the gates of hell. The hell that's all around us every day in the lives of broken people with broken relationships, who are hurting, who are in pain, who are lonely, who don't know who Jesus is, and who don't know that there's a place in this world where they're loved. And we're imprisoned by that. It's time for us to storm the gates of hell. And if Jesus is serious, like if he means what he says here, that he's building this church and the gates of hell cannot prevail against it, and I usually just assume Jesus is serious when he says stuff and that he keeps his promises. If he's serious, and I think he is, what it means is it's not us who should be afraid. It's darkness that should fear because we're bringing the light. It's brokenness that should fear because we're bringing healing. It's hopelessness that should fear because we're bringing hope. It's hatred that should fear because we're bringing love. It's loneliness that should fear because we're bringing community. It's the devil that should fear because we're bringing Jesus. When the problem is severe, the cure has to be powerful. And the church, for all of its failures, and it has a lot, for all of its warts, and it has a lot, for all of its shortcomings, and it has a lot, the church is the only vehicle in the world powerful enough to be a catalyst for real hope and real change. And the church can only do that by going out into a broken and hurting world and proclaiming a real Jesus who's alive and who came and wants to invite people into community where they're loved. And the church can only do that if it's willing to cast fear aside and storm the gates of the hell that surrounds us every day in the lives of broken people. And if we do it, if we catch that vision, this vision that Jesus is casting for his disciples, this picture that he's painting for his disciples when he starts to tell them about the church, if we just allow Jesus to captivate our hearts with this, then by God's grace and through his power, we can be a part of building not just a better Revision church for ourselves, but better Des Moines for the people around us. We're the church. That's our name. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us this crazy, weird, awkward, failing often, amazing, incredible, catalytic thing called the church. And Lord, we confess that we haven't always, as individuals and as a community and as a collective, been the church that you want us to be. We haven't always lived out your vision of it, but we thank you for painting this picture for us of what your church is and what it can be in this world. Because we know that evil looks different now than it did 2,000 years ago, but it's real. That hurt is real, that pain is real, that suffering is real, that there are so many people out there in our world whose reservoirs of hope have dried up and they don't know where to turn and they don't know what's next and they're lonely and broken. Lord, we just pray that Revision, that this community would be a community that just lets you set our hearts on fire and captivate our imaginations for this idea that your church is a catalytic force to bring love and bring hope and bring this message that you are the God who came for us to the people in our world who so desperately need it. Thank you for the church. Let us be the kind of church that you designed and created and invite us to be. Amen.